Hi folks, welcome to this video on principles of training. Again, this is a potential essay topic, section B question. A couple of things about it. The times it's been up before, they haven't been as generous to just say, right, tell us about the principles of training. Remember, you've got to make 7-8 points if you want to be pushing for the top marks on the essay question. That's 7-8 points per topic in the essay. I think it would be unbelievably generous if they were to just say, right, sport and fit, tell us what they are. The two times it's been up, in the past, it's just concentrated on specificity and overload. So you had to make 7 points just on those two principles. And more recently, it's been up for principles of weight training. So you'd have to relate SPORT, the principles of training, to a particular aspect of training. And we might have a little, we'll have a little chat about this as we just go through this brief video, but it's only going to be a very brief one. Okay, first things first, principles of training, what are they? Okay, so there they are. Specificity, progression, overload, reversibility, and tedium. What we need is a definition of each, but equally, because it's an essay question, we've got to maybe do a little bit of application. We've got to show how that we'd use it. Common errors that people make, and I don't want you to make these in the exam. What is specificity? People always go, make sure training is specific to the sport. You will not get away with that. The word specific is in specificity. So you can't use part of the word to define the full word. They will just not allow it. So what we've got to say is that training is specific, but put it in a slightly different way. And an easy way to do it is like this. So by putting training recreates the demands of the sport, we are saying that training is specific to the sport, but without using the word specific. So, using that recreates the demands of the sport. That is the key way of doing it. Now, like I said, specificity and overload has been an essay question, those two on their own. So we need to say a few other things about specificity. So what can we say? Well, we can say the following. If our training is going to recreate the demands of the sport, we've got to make sure, not in any particular order, but we are training the correct muscle groups, okay? No point in a shot putter doing everything on the legs. They need to be working on the shoulders, the arms, things like that in order to, to make sure that they're generating power at the right parts of the body. They need to make sure they're training the correct skills and techniques. And we need to make sure we're training the correct fitness types. Remember, stamina, speed, strength, flexibility, power, agility. Only some of these are important to your sport. Only train the ones that are. There's no point in Usain Bolt training agility. He doesn't change direction at speed. It's straight line sprinting. At the very worst, it's a gradual curve on a bend for 200 metres. So making sure you train the correct fitness types. Okay? Moving on to progression. That's quite brief and short. What is progression? Training must gradually get harder. Okay? The training must progress. What I don't want you to do is fall into the trap of talking about, progressive overload. Remember, you're trying to make as many points as you can. If you talk about progressive overload, you are combining progression and overload together. So you're actually minimizing the number of points that you're making. So talk about progression on its own. Training must gradually get harder. But then that does naturally lead us on to overload. Now, what is overload? This is what you've got to do every single session. What have you got to do every single session? It's not a nice word, but you've got to stress the body. People go, stress is bad for you. Too much psychological stress is bad for you. But remember, we're talking about physiological stress, stressing your body, your physiology. So making the muscles work harder than they're used to. That's what you are overloading your system. That is essentially what we are saying. Now, there has been a question, as I've said a couple of times now, on specificity and overload together. We're trying to make 7 points. There's a definition of specificity. There's point number 1. 1, 2, 3, another 3 things to say about specificity there. So we've got to make a few things about overload. We can say it stresses the body, but the key thing about overload, how do we stress the body? We stress the body by following FIT. F-I-T-T. So every time or any time you get asked about fit, they are talking about overload. Every time they ask you about overload, they are talking about fit. Mention them both. We're going to deal with fit in a minute on the separate slide. We're just going to quickly finish off with these principles. So penultimately, reversibility. Again, not much you can say about it, a bit like progression. Reversibility is you will lose all the fitness that you've built up if you stop training for a period of time. Okay? So adaptations will be lost if you stop training. We sometimes call it the rule of the third. If you train for 3 months and then stop training for a month, you will lose all those adaptations. So you unfortunately lose the adaptations in a third of the time it took you to build them up, which isn't great, but that's just the way we're built. You train for 3 weeks and you stop for a week, you lose all your adaptations. So yeah, the longer you train, the longer it will take to lose the adaptations, but it will still take only a third of the time to lose them, okay? So don't get it confused with rest. You must rest. You must take time off to let the body recover. What we're talking about here is prolonged time off, weeks off, months off. That's when you'll start to reverse your training. Finally then is tedium. If something is tedious, it is boring. If something is boring, your effort and motivation drops and you will not improve. So in order to avoid tedium, we must have variety in our training. There must be different exercises, different orders. Don't go in and do the same 5 exercises in the same order every single week, because after a few weeks, tedium will kick in. So it's doing lots of different types of training in order to maintain the variety. I've said this to a few of my students before. The film 300, where the actors play the Spartans and they're all in really, really good shape, all the actors, their famous training program for about 6 months, they did 6 days training a week for 6 months. And in that 6 months, no 2 training sessions were the same. So that is showing that these boys really avoided the tedium. They did a lot of variety. Why is that good? Because it constantly makes your body adapt. If your body's never done something before, it has to adapt to the new training exercise, the new routine. So if everything is constantly new, it means the body is continuously adapting. It's continuously changing and improving. So that's another good way to make sure that we make improvements. Okay, so I said I'd quickly finish on this. FIT principle, F-I-T-T. As we've shown there, it is related to overload. Never mention one without mentioning the other. Always bring the other one in. Overload, very, very, very quickly. Let's just remind ourselves, what is it? It's applying stress to the body. It is making the body work harder than it is used to. That is how we stress the body. If you go in and lift a weight that you've always lifted and you wake up the next morning and there's no aches or pains in the muscles, you haven't overloaded. Equally, that means you haven't adapted, you haven't improved your fitness. You've maintained your fitness, and if that's all you're after, fine, not a problem. But if we're after improving fitness, we've got to work the body harder than it's used to. And we do that by following FITT. So frequency is the F, and that is how often you train. Put that in the exam, you might get a mark. How can I definitely get a mark? Remember, we are relating FITT to overload. So how do I stress the body using frequency? Well, quite simply, by training more times per week. That's how I create overload, using the FIT principle. Frequency, I train more times per week. Intensity then, how hard I train, okay? Now the obvious thing to say here is, well, to create overload, you've got to say train harder. That is what we're going to say, but this is where we need to give some examples. Things like heavier weights, more reps, more sets, less recovery, something like that. You've got to give examples. Remember I said at the start, we've had this question asked 2 ways. What is specificity and overload? And then how would you, or principles of weight training. This is where you have to think about it. If you just put, how does a weight trainer improve through the principles of training, or intensity, train harder, you didn't get the mark. You had to say things like train harder using heavier weights, more reps, more sets, things like that. Remember, it is still an essay. These aren't short answer questions. You've got to give a bit of flesh to the bones. You've got to add a bit of detail there. One of the T's, and it doesn't matter which order you do these T's in, one of the T's is time, how long you train. So obviously, to overload the body, we train longer runs, longer distances. But equally, yeah, I've gone down the they're running out of the side here, but longer sprints. If you was a sprint performer or a power athlete or something like that, circuit training, do 2 laps of the circuit instead of 1. So again, there's lots of different ways of increasing the time to overload the body. And finally then, the last T, a lot of people write tedium in here. You won't get the mark for that, although it is very similar. Type of training is the final T. The method that you are doing, the type of training you are doing. And we want more variety. Now here's my little top tip. When it's been up in the past and I've asked for type, it's always said in the mark scheme, need to give 2 examples, okay, in order to get the mark for type. And that's what I've done here. So by saying something like type is the method of training and you need to include more variety, you're absolutely right, but you're not going to get the mark. What you've got to say is, for example, an athlete could do interval training and then mix it in with some fartlek training. So you're doing 2 different types of training. You could say weight training and circuit training. Okay? As long as you're giving a couple of different examples of how you could do different types of training, you will guarantee the mark. So that is everything you need to know on the principles of training. But what you do need to do is, if it's a principles of training question, is relate it to the example or the scenario that they put you in. Okay? They might say how we could use the principles of training to set up a training program for a sprinter. You've got to get the same theory down on these 2 slides, but talk about sprint-based training and weight training and circuit training and longer sprints and quicker recovery and increasing the number of sprint sessions you do per week and targeting specific muscle groups for sprinting, such as the legs. So you've just got to make sure you apply the theory to the example that they give you. Good luck with it, folks.